Definition: the brain is an organ that serves as the center of the nervous system in our vertebrate and most invertebrate animals. It is located in the head, usually close to the primary sensory organs.
The nervous system, the brain, spinal cord, and nerves, is a living communications network, carrying various kinds of messages to and from the different parts of your body. The nervous system is composed of nerve fibers that conduct information into your spinal cord and brain, and the other nerve fibers that send information out to different parts of your body. The cells that make up the various parts of the nervous system are called neurons. Each neuron has a neuron body, a part of the cell which contains a nucleus and other structures. But a typical neuron has two other kinds of structures: long fibers that extend in different directions from the body of the cell. These fibers are often wrapped with a fatty substance called myelin. Fibers that carry impulses toward the neuron body are called dendrites. Fibers that carry impulses away are called axons. Different structures are concentrated in different parts of the body. Some neuron bodies are bound into clusters called ganglia. They are often associated with your spinal cord. The spinal cord is a long cylinder of nerve tissue that passes through the hollow channels of bones called the vertebrae. The spinal cord is protected by those vertebrae. It is also protected by three membranes called meninges.
Neurons. These neurons communicate with one another by means of long protoplasmatic fibers called axons, which carry trains of signal pulse called action potentials to distant parts of the brain.
Neurons are highly specialized cells. Unlike other cells, neurons conduct electrical signals and can transmit these signals to other neurons. A typical neuron consists of three components: the cell body, also called the soma, and two types of processes sprouting off the cell body, known as dendrites and axons. The cell body is not unlike other cell types of cell bodies. It contains the nucleus, as well as the organelles that drive energy production. Importantly, the axon hillock is a specialized cone-shaped region of the cell body where the electrical signal begins.
Physiology. Physiologically, the function of the brain is to exert centralized control over the other organs of the body. The brain acts of the rest of the body both by generating patterns of muscle activity and by driving the secretion of chemicals called hormones. This centralized control allows rapid and uncoordinated responses to changes in the environment. Anatomy. The simplest way to gain information about brain anatomy is by visual inspection, but many more sophisticated techniques have been developed. Brain tissue in its natural state is too soft to work with, but it can be hardened by immersion in alcohol or other fixatives, and then slice apart cellular structure. The brain of all species are composed primarily of two broad classes of cells, neurons and glia cells. Glial cells, also known as glial of neuroglia, come in several types and perform a number of critical functions including structural support, metabolic support, insulation, and guidance of development. Neurons, however, are usually considered the most important cells in the brain. The property that makes neurons unique is their axons. These axons transmit signals in the form of electrochemical pulses called action potentials, which last less than 1,000 of a second and travel along the axon at speeds of 100 meters per second. Some neurons emit action potential constantly at rates of 10 and 100 per second, usually an irregular.
There are three general sections to most nerve cells or neurons. First, there are the highly branched processes, known as dendrites, which project from the cell body, also known as the soma. Most neurons possess an especially long process, known as the axon, which conducts electrical impulses. This axon can then branch at its terminus into a number of synaptic knobs, also known as axon terminals or synaptic end bulbs. In most neurons, the dendrites are highly branched processes which allow a neuron to monitor a very large area for stimuli. The soma, or cell body, possesses the parts which a typical cell does, a nucleus, mitochondria. It is here that the DNA is located, that proteins are made, and many things are packaged into vesicles for transport. The axon is a very long process which conducts electrical messages. So when the brain communicates with the hand, or the leg communicates with the spinal cord, electrical messages must pass a considerable distance, and this is the role of the axon, to conduct this electrical impulse over long distances in many cases. At the branch points of the axon, known as the synaptic knobs, this is where a neuron may touch a second cell. So a neuron may contact another neuron, a muscle cell, a gland cell, and at these synaptic knobs, chemical messengers, known as neurotransmitters, can be released, which then have an effect on the second cell.
Neurotransmitter and receptors. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that are released at synapses when an action potential activates them. Neurotransmitter attack themselves to receptor molecules on the membrane of the synapse target cell, and thereby alter the electrical or chemical properties of the receptor molecules.
Communication between two neurons begins when an electrical impulse called an action potential travels along the axon of a presynaptic neuron toward the axon terminal. The action potential cannot cross the synaptic space. When it reaches the axon terminal, it causes membranous sacs called vesicles to move toward the membrane of the axon terminal. The membrane of the vesicle fuses with the membrane of the axon terminal, enabling the vesicle to release its contents into the synaptic space. The molecules released from the vesicles are chemicals called neurotransmitters. They drift across the synaptic space and bind to special proteins called receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. The binding of a neurotransmitter to its receptor can trigger an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. That electrical signal then moves toward the cell body of the postsynaptic neuron. Now that the neurotransmitter has relayed its message, it releases from the receptor into the synaptic space. Some of the neurotransmitter is degraded by enzymes in the synaptic space, and some of the neurotransmitter is carried back into the presynaptic neuron through transporter proteins. The neurotransmitter that is taken back up into the presynaptic neuron is then repackaged into vesicles that can be released the next time an action potential reaches the axon terminal. The entire process repeats each time an action potential reaches the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron. Communication between two neurons begins when an electrical impulse called an action potential travels along the axon of a presynaptic neuron toward the axon terminal.
Their effects by altering a specific
The action potential
neurotransmitter
cannot cross the synaptic space.
This applies
When
to
it reaches
drugs
the
such
axon
as
terminal, it
marijuana,
causes membranous
nicotine,
sacs called
heroin,
vesicles to
cocaine,
move toward the membrane
alcohol,
of the axon terminal.
fluoxetine,
The membrane of the
chlorpromazine,
vesicle fuses
and
with the
many
membrane of the
others.
axon terminal, enabling the vesicle to release its contents into the
The brain
synaptic
is the
space.
most complex organ in a
The
vertebrate's body.
molecules released from the
In a
vesicles
typical
are
human,
chemicals
the cerebral
called
cortex,
neurotransmitters.
the
They
largest
drift across
part,
the
is
synaptic
estimated
space
to
and bind to
contain
special proteins
15
called
and
receptors on
33
the postsynaptic neuron.
Some basic types of
The binding of a
responsiveness,
neurotransmitter to
such
its
as
receptor can
reflexes,
trigger an
can
action
be mediated
potential
by
in the
the spinal
postsynaptic
cord
neuron.
of peripheral
That electrical signal then moves toward the cell